Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Margaret Ann Takashi, the Executive Director. We are delighted to have you with us for this special presentation. Sleeping Giant State Park celebrates 100 years this month, and we are pleased to bring you two programs to mark this milestone. Tonight's program, The Founding of Sleeping Giant State Park, is with Trina, Mace, and we hope you will join us again on Saturday, November 9th, from 12 to 4, for a look at what's in the Whitney Library with park researcher Julie Holton and our librarian Emma Norton. You will soon hear how the path to creating one of Connecticut's most beloved public hiking destinations was neither quick nor easy. I first heard Trina's dynamic story of the park's creation at an early lecture she presented at Ellen Park in Cheshire, and it was a tale of conflicting priorities and hard-reached resolutions, destructive commercial interests, the public's passion for preservation, and thorny legal battles. Trina followed 25 years of twists and turns that culminated in the beautiful park we love today. Trina's passion for Sleeping Giant State Park came out of a graduate photography course she took at Wesleyan University during the pandemic. Weekly assigned hikes led to her discovery of structures in the west end of the park. Curiosity led to her master's thesis. When not snapping pictures of the giant, Trina is the executive director of Creative Arts Workshop here in New Haven. She chairs the city's Historic District Commission and sits on the boards of the New Haven Museum. She is our board president. And at the Sleeping Giants Park Association. So we welcome Trina.
There's the magic. Oh, I love it. I love it. Welcome, and thank you all for being here. Thank you, Margaret Ann and the New Haven Museum for inviting me here this evening. And thanks to the Whitney Library downstairs and the wonderful materials here. It's really quite a treasure trove, and much of my research was done here, as well as at the Hamden Historical Society. So those are really great resources. This talk is the founding of Sleeping Giant State Park, a quarter century that saved the giant. And I'm guessing that you're here this evening because you know a sleeping giant, of course. You've seen his outline on the northern horizon as you drive up I-91. Perhaps you've hiked the 32 miles of groomed trails, climbed the steps of the Stone Tower, snapped a few panoramic photos from your iPhone. And if you've hiked the violet, blue, or red diamond trails, those on the western end that navigate the Giant's Head, you may have wondered about the mysterious abandoned nave structures you found, or the deep gash in the earth, appearing to have scalped the giant. That's right, I said scalped the giant. This attribution of human traits and feelings, a recumbent giant, his head, his exposed scalp, are really very compelling for all of us. This does have a name, anthropomorphism, and it factors greatly in our zeal for saving the park and the giant, culminating exactly 100 years ago in the establishment of this beloved state park. Let's go back a little bit. Long before John Davenport sailed into New Haven Harbor, the Quinnipiac occupied this fertile valley that we think of as being defined by East Rock, West Rock, and the Sleeping Giant, then called Mount Carmel. Hobbamock, as the mountain was known to the Quinnipiac, was a subject of awe and spirituality, actually. But Hobbamock, the animate giant made of stone, as they believed, was, you might say, prone to temper tantrums. In fact, at one time he expressed his anger by stomping his foot in Middletown, Connecticut, thereby diverting the river, which now empties out, consequently, at Old Saybrook. That was Hobbamock. Well, one of the things that the Quinnipiac had to wonder was, might Hobbamock get upset again? The spirit Kiatan was summoned to help. Kiatan enticed Hobbamock to fill his pockets with oysters and minerals, two of his favorite things. Those weighed down his pockets considerably. Then Kitan cast a spell on Havamak, putting Havamak, of course, into eternal slumber. Remember, deep pockets, heavy pockets. Eternal slumber. This folklore, of course, has been passed down through generations, and we read children's books that retell this tale a bit. But let me also bring you to someone else who told this tale very well, and that's the former U.S. Poet Laureate and Hamden native Donald Hall. He wrote a poem called The Sleeping Giant, a hill so named in Hamden, Connecticut, about his childhood fears that the giant would awaken. The whole day long, under the walking sun, that poised an eye on me from a high floor. Holding my toy beside the clapboard house, I looked for him the summer I was 4. And then I'll go to the last stanza of the poem. That was the summer I expected him. Later, the high and watchful sun instead walked low behind the house, and school began, and winter pulled a sheet over his head. Anthropomorphism. Now, also at Mount Carmel, again, our sleeping giant, this geological origins go back actually 200 million years for the Triassic phase and volcanic activity, which is crucial because that's what created what we now call the basaltic ridges, also known as trap rock. This ridge is the same ridge that formed East Rock, West Rock, and goes all the way up to Mount Tom in Massachusetts, so it's quite an extensive formation. One of the things that will come into play as we talk a little bit more this evening is that this basalt is a hard stone, and it has a particular characteristic that when it fractures in geometric shapes. And that's important because those geometric shapes have the ability to interconnect, to sit together in ways that make them very, very strong when aggregated. It's also what's known as trap rock, and that you see this is a photograph I took of a trap rock outcropping. This is on the Tower Trail on the way up to the tower at Sleeping Giant. Trap rock comes from the Swedish word for steps, trappa, and it's because the rock, as it's broken, also forms steps. Now let's talk about Mount Carmel itself. So in 1910, Mount Carmel was a pretty busy place. Whitney Avenue had tremendous traffic, whether it's horse and buggies, rail cars, few automobiles. The north-south rail line stopped there. You can see the depot here. That's now a restaurant. The Farmington Canal was in use for commercial transport. And several industries thrived, actually, on the banks of the Mill River, which runs around the head of the giant. There was a brass carriage hardware shop down on I Street. There was an axle factory closer to the head of the giant. And there was already plans for a trap rock quarry up on York Hill. York Hill is now where the second campus of Quinnipiac is. So if we think about the citizens of Mount Carmel, this was probably the person that you would have called mayor. This is Willis Cook. Now, Willis Cook kind of did everything in Mount Carmel. He was a judge. He was the postmaster. He was a volunteer fireman. And he lived on Whitney Avenue, and he owned 30 acres of land behind him, bounded on the north by Tuttle Avenue, on the southern side by Mount Carmel Avenue, on the west by Whitney Avenue, and on the east by the cliff of the chin of the giant. In other words, he owned the giant's head. So he became pretty important. Now, at this time, actually, all of the giant was owned by individuals. So he wasn't unusual, except that this was such a prominent place that he owned. He did have a mill property, the axle factory, that he leased to this axle works. And he built a cabin on the chin's head. Here's a picture, a drawing actually, of the cabin. But on the picture on the left, the large picture that's behind Willis Cook, you can see that You might think it's a little wart on the chin, but it's actually Judge Cook's cabin. It's pretty interesting. Now, this idyllic life that Cook had developed was interrupted by two circumstances in 1910, and this is where we start to see our story get interesting. First, his cabin on the top of the chin, which was so prominent that it became a magnet for adventurers. Yale students, Cook asserted, were trespassing. In fact, they were vandalizing it. They would simply climb up to the top of the head and went there, even though they didn't belong. He had many trespassing signs. But they found out that if they left their mark, that it was a dare when they got back to campus for their friends to try and leave another mark, and then another mark, and another mark. And then there became a little bit of theft because there was souvenir taking, until finally the Yale students, Cook's assertion, not mine, the Yale students burned down the place. So clearly the cabin was no longer a refuge for Cook and his wife. At the same time, a little stroke of bad luck, also in 1910, the axle factory burnt down. Yale not involved. Just clarify that. So Cook was left with a great deal of land, hefty property taxes, but neither revenue nor relaxation to show for it. Well, you can imagine that in 1911, when an outfit called Connecticut Trap Rock Quarries came knocking on Cook's door, he was ready to listen. The basalt of Mount Carmel might be of some use. And at that time, there were already 24 trap rock quarries in Connecticut. 24 trap rock quarries. This was not an unusual industry. This is actually a very common industry. So the combination of the trap rock quarries ideas and Cook's land could be a godsend. Trap rock people said, might Judge Cook lease some land for us? He did, of course. He negotiated a 20-year lease, which was written to mostly because he knew that it would take some time to put together a quarry. A quarry is a rather complicated operation, so he wanted to make sure that people had enough time. But for 20 years, and he signed this lease in July of 1911, the lease offered the following. It offered him 20 years of tenancy by the quarry operation. It offered that he would be paid 2 cents for every cubic yard. That was actually substantial at that time. And it was going to be renewable. Again, a recognition of the amount of time that it takes to establish a quarry. But here is the one caveat that he sought to put in here. And this becomes crucial in later years. And that is that Cook told the quarry operators not to take any rock at any point where the quarry face will show from Mount Carmel Avenue. Remember, this was a judge. He had standing in the community. He knew that this was a beloved facade. He knew that there was a vista from anywhere in New Haven looking north. So he didn't want to be the person who let that be ruined. So setting up the quarry, as I said, was no small task. It took the better part of a year. They needed to cut a service road from Tuttle Avenue. They needed to lay small gauge rail. They built structures that supported the quarry's operation. There was a steam plant. There was a stone crusher, 2 stone crushers actually, a sorting shed. Stone needed to be sifted in different sizes for transport and for sale to different functions. Machine shop, munition storage, worker housing, etc. This was a substantial operation. And all of that before they could open up the quarry. Another thing that they needed to do was scrape off the overburden. Now, that may not be a term that's familiar to you, but overburden is the vegetation and the soil that sits on top of the usable rock. If it's separated after you've pulled the rock away from the mountain, it's a very, very expensive procedure. So all the overburden was cleared, and then the rock could be quarried. This was a pretty big deal. Let me back up. I'm going to say just a little bit about also what it was like to work on the quarry. There were the mechanisms that were used were basically steam shovels. Everything else, or steam driven. So the rail system was steam driven. Everything else was by hand. So they were doing quite a bit of work in a very difficult way. The men were grouped in pairs, and they were expected to do at least what were called fill their gondolas with two-man rocks. A two-man rock being the size of a rock that two could carry. That was important because they got paid by the tonnage. So it wasn't to their advantage to have a rock that took 3 people, because it meant that the divvying up of the fees were just a little bit more. There's also the head of the quarry wrote in a speech that he gave to a national organization in the early 60s, long after he had retired. And the owner of the quarry explained that none of the men working here were known by their names. They were Italian immigrants, brought to work at the quarry because they were familiar with working in the stone industries. But the foreman found it too difficult to say their names. So the foreman made a decision not to memorize any of the names. Each worker got a brass tag with a number, and their pay was issued according to the number on their brass tag. So kind of an interesting early thought. But then the question here is, who uses trap rock? Let's talk about that. Well, what do we suppose is happening here for this trap rock? What do we think is using it? Mostly trap rock is used to build roads or highways, beds of some sort. Could be a rail bed, could be a road. But here's what's happening right at this time, and this is crucial to why the trap rock quarry was so profitable and so viable. Henry Ford brought out the Model T in 1907. It cost $850. But by 1915, Henry Ford had sold a million. And now they only cost $425. And then 9 years later, in 1924, Henry T's Model T had reached sales of 10 million cars. Now, a Model T costs $290. So in just 17 years, the Tin Lizzie went from a luxury purchase to transportation for the common person. Now Connecticut needed roads, more roads, faster roads, safer roads, and they were all built on trap rock. Also at this time, the Connecticut Highway Department was feeling this exponential growth. From its inception in 1896 with an annual budget of $45,000, their budget grew to $16 million by 1928. This is just astonishing. And cleverly, the head of the Department of Motor Vehicles, which was established in 1907 in Connecticut, when 3,000 motor vehicles were actually on the state's roads, he convinced the state legislature that licensing fees and registration fees could and should only go to his department's budget. Well, that was a pretty good idea. And by 1921, we actually had a gas tax in Connecticut. It was 2 cents per gallon, which was very hefty at that time. So there was a third source of revenue. So meanwhile, the quarry's in full production. It has plenty of customers to build these roads that are ever in demand. And I say that because in hindsight, we think about the quarrying of rock as the degradation of a natural resource. But in this context, we also need to think about the demand. So the supply and demand, how many of us as citizens wanted to have a safer road for our car, wanted to be sure to drive our Tin Lizzie on something. So it was pretty important. And, we'll say a little bit more. I just gave you everything you need to know about that. So let's go on to where we were in the production. Now we're at 10 years in the trap rock quarry. And Willis Cook is feeling good because he has gotten revenue from 636,000 cubic yards of trap rock. This is actually the background of this is a photograph that appeared in the New Haven Register in the 20s after a fatality. The cliff face had let go after some heavy rains, and 2 people and a steam shovel were buried, and that resulted in fatalities. So it was pretty tough. Okay, so we've talked about industry. We've talked about what's happening up on Mount Carmel. We talked about the head of the giant. Well, what else is happening here? Well, first of all, this is the era of the progressive movement. So during the progressive movement, a lot of things happened that are all things with which you're familiar, certainly. Began in the late 19th century. John Muir at this time had founded the Sierra Club. Painters Thomas Cole and Frederick Church, this is a Frederick Church painting in the background, were idealizing nature, and there was a real enthusiasm for these monumental canvases that really described the beauty of nature. This is actually a painting of West Rock that Frederick Church did. In the 1890 census had declared the West closed. Well, that sounds funny, but what that means is that at this time there was a sense that all of the homesteaders, anyone who was taking claim in the West, that the census takers felt that the West had now been taken, was closed. There were no opportunities. So that also led to a conservation movement, a sense of things should be protected, they should be conserved. Teddy Roosevelt was actually a proponent of that, and he created the agriculture's first Forest Bureau. Now, closer to home, in 1900, Yale established its School of Forestry. The gentleman in the middle, Gifford Pinchot, was the person who was largely responsible for it. He and his parents gave the university a gift of $300,000. And Pinchot was also a friend of Roosevelt, so he'd been very tied into this progressive movement. The graduate program at Yale was a bit counterintuitive in the sense that there was no undergraduate curriculum that fed into this master's program. But then President Hadley felt that it was important that Yale University have programs that put men in public service, and he was very much in favor of this. They had to hire professors, of course. They did have 7 students enrolled in the first class, so they needed some professors. And they hired 2 professors. The first one, the gentleman on the right, is Henry Graves. Henry Graves had gone to Yale, and then he'd gone to Harvard. He studied botany, and then he worked for the Forest Service under Pinchot. He was only 29, but he was quite gregarious. He was very well known. He, of course, was appropriately bred. He was a natural to be appointed as the first professor. The second was a person who was a little less likely, and that's James Toomey on the left. These were the first 2 professors. I say the second. They were appointed at the same time. But James Toomey did not have the same sort of pedigree that Graves had. James Toomey had graduated from the Michigan State Agricultural College, and he was a silviculturist, which means that he was particularly interested in the research around forestry. Graves was quite complimentary, though, about Toomey when he described him as scientific, an investigator of keen perception with a persistence in carrying his studies to a conclusion. This would be key. Graves would go on to say, Toomey is very optimistic and courageous in the face of obstacles, with a spirit of devotion that wins a following. Well, this would also come into play. In 1915, Toomey had gone and had made a speech at a dinner club in New Haven. And in this speech, he talked quite eloquently about the real need to increase the area of publicly owned forests and the saner utilization and better care of the larger areas of forests privately owned. He thought that maybe, he even proposed, should not the city of New Haven own the Mount Carmel forest? protect and improvement and make this 2,000 acres of woodland a forest for the people. Of course, this was all privately owned land on Mount Carmel, so that was a little bit presumptuous to think that that might happen. But he got his friend Anson Stokes Phelps, at that time, who was the secretary of Yale University. They spent a lot of time thinking about this, and Toomey really thought that this was a viable idea, that the closest, pretty much undisturbed forest to the city of New Haven was Mount Carmel, and let's make that a public woodland forest. All that was well and good until World War I broke out. And Toomey just felt that it was almost immoral to pursue at-home concerns when the war was going on. His papers have also alluded to the many of his students who were fighting, and he spent a great deal of time during World War I thinking about his students who were not at the forestry school but were fighting around the world. So he laid aside the matter of thinking about Mount Carmel until after the war was over. Well, it took until 1923 for him to come back to really working on this project, and he went to a meeting of the residents of Mount Carmel, who by this time were a little bit annoyed about all of the quarrying going on and really, really wanted to save the mountain. But it was more than that. It was tempting to think that the destruction of the giant scalp was the motivator, but in fact, the forest was prone to forest fires. There was a lot of other inadequate protection of wildlife. There was just this sense of exploitation. And so the people at Mount Carmel formed an association to think about this and work toward some sort of organization that would help preserve the forest. You can imagine this was music to Toomey's ears, so he was fully involved in it. And this is their articles of, it's actually the resolutions that they passed in this January 1923 meeting. They did talk to the state quite a bit, and the state actually was willing to give to them $40,000 toward what the state called a wild woodland park. And that's important because Toomey, for instance, at that time was well aware of the Olmsted Design Park system in New Haven. He knew about groomed parks. He felt that that was very inappropriate for what the forestry school represented, so he was really looking for the opportunity to preserve a wild woodland park. And here was the state enjoying that and being part of that. What was also interesting was that the state was appreciating the amount of land that this group of people was starting to collect. They were actually attracting donations, and the state felt that they had a real opportunity here. So we start to see the beginning of a public-private partnership. And then we finally start the Sleeping Giant Park Association. Now this is a little bit curious because they were founded in March of 1924, and they had very specific issues. They wanted to acquire land, they wanted to promote forest interests, they wanted to bring that land to the state park system, they wanted to save Mount Carmel from destruction, they wanted to be sure that scientific study was preserved and encouraged, and they wanted to be able to solicit funds for more property. I say that's interesting because these are 6 pretty important obligations or goals of this association. The fact is that really only one of them is about the quarry, and that's because from the chin to the toes was a substantial amount of forest land for the Sleeping Giant Park Association to take charge of, and they had plenty of work to do trying to convince owners to either donate their land or sell it to them in a very reasonable way. So they weren't so concerned about the quarry operation. That was privately held, and that was a going concern, and they had other things to worry about. They did make a lot of progress, though. This is actually a map that lives downstairs, right below us here in this very building. It's from 1928, but leading up to that, By the 1st of April in 1924, the Sleeping Giant Park Association had already turned over 197 acres to the state. On October 12, 1924, the park was formally opened as a state park to the public. By 1927, they added another 500 acres, 1928 another 600 acres, and in 1929 another 800 acres. So this was a really rapid progression of convincing landowners to either deed over their land to the state or to the Park Association, or to sell it at a reasonable price. But yet, on the other end of the mountain, the scalping continued, and by 1925, Connecticut Trap Rock Quarries, in 13 years now of operation, had extracted 793,000 cubic feet of trap rock. Pretty substantial. At this time, we start to see a major figure in the history of the park, and that's Ray Regaluth. He was a Hopkins grammar school graduate. He was the Yale class in 1908, and he's the treasurer of Connecticut Trap Rock Quarries. He had married into the Blakesley family. They owned the company, and he assumed an leadership role very quickly for the rest of his career with the company. He stayed in New Haven after Yale and kept in touch with many of his classmates. In fact, one of his classmates, Simeon Baldwin, would be one of the more generous benefactors to the Park Association. So now we're starting to see how we're coming up with these tensions between the Park Association and the people who were running the quarry. The Park Association did set up a meeting with the quarry operators, specifically Ray Regaluth, and asked what it would take to buy him out. And as you can see from the numbers on this slide, the number that Regaluth suggested was that this deal could be done for $655,000. Little footnote here is that's $10.3 million in today's money, so that was not going to happen. Oops, sorry. Let me come here. Here's another reason why I brought up Regaluth's affiliation. So Arnold Dana, who was the second in command at the Park Association, Arnold Dana was a person who particularly wanted to make sure that the quarrying was stopped. As a child, at age 12, Arnold Dana had fallen almost to his death from the chin of the giant, and he survived. And when he survived, he had a lifelong ambition to pay back the giant for saving his life. So as he became involved in this association, as he got excited about really returning the head to the park and not having it quarried any further, we started to see him engaging in this negotiation with Regaluth. Well, right around this time, Regaluth decided to build a house on Livingston Street, 150 yards from Dana's house. So down on the left, this is a picture I took just the other day, so there actually is one house in between the two. But now what we start to realize is that what we thought was a tension at Mount Carmel, what we thought was this give and take and tug of war between the Sleeping Giant Park Association and the Connecticut Trap Rock Quarries, is now actually also a neighborhood skirmish on the 300 block of Livingston Street. It's a crazy idea. They'd both gone to Hopkins Grammar School. They were both Yale graduates. They lived just right next to each other. I can't even imagine what dog walks were like, but well, no. Finally, things take a little bit of an interesting turn. By 1930, Willis Cook dies, and he's left his land and his debts to his widow, Nellie. Nellie is besieged by the neighbors who are so frustrated about the blasting, the noise, the dust, all the destruction that's happening every day with the quarry. So let me just say that part of the quarry process is a dynamite that's used to blast the quarry out of the face of the stone out of the face of the quarry. So dynamite at that time was not an exact science. It caused this rock to go flying, sometimes literally a mile away. People would step out in their yard and a boulder would come from the sky. So this was not neighborly. And Willis Cook might have felt okay about it because he felt it was bringing him revenue. But by this time, Nellie Cook was a little less convinced. She didn't want to be a landlord. And for some reason, perhaps because we were getting into the Depression, the demand for trap rock was lessening a bit. And this quarry was perhaps expiring a little bit, unless it was going to go much, much deeper into the mountain. Which meant that the year that her husband died, she received $1,329 in revenue from the quarry. $300 of that was taken as property taxes. So this was not keeping her afloat. It was a huge headache, and she tried to figure out what she could do about it. So, of course, she called up the Sleeping Giant Park Association people, James Toomey and Arnold Dana, and said, would you consider buying my land? So she did this perhaps a little out of sequence because first what she did was she looked at the lease soon after Willis had died. She looked at the lease, realized that there was a renewal clause for the trap rock quarry, and signed it. So now they were in their second lease, the very beginning of the second lease. They had another 20 years to do their quarrying legally with her lease. But on the other hand, she thought, well, if the Sleeping Giant Park Association will buy me out, then I could do more with the capital than I could with this piddly little income from their cubic yards here and there. So she did. She convinced the Park Association to buy the land. She asked $65,000 for it. They finally settled on $50,000 and raised it relatively quickly. And by July of 1930, the Sleeping Giant Park Association was the landlord of the Connecticut Trap Rock Quarry Company. Well, that's a little crazy. And Arnold Dana, being a pragmatist, but also being a fairly sophisticated business person and a bit of the landed gentry here on Livingston Street in New Haven, did not argue. He just took them to court. So he went to court to say that he felt that the quarry operation was in violation of their lease. They were in violation because in the estimation of all the citizens, now the quarry face could be seen from Mount Carmel. And I think that was probably true. Let's look at this one picture again. This picture was taken, I've taken a similar picture. This picture was taken from Mount Carmel Avenue. So I can see it. I think everyone else could see it too. Well, the Trap Rock Company was not happy about being taken to court, so they countersued asking for a bond. They wanted a $100,000 bond from the Sleeping Giant Park Association to guard against any loss of revenue in case they prevailed. That is, the quarry company prevailed. This volley went back and forth 14 times. Suits, countersuits, etc. Until finally, let me go here. It went through the Supreme Court of Errors, Court of Appeals, and there was a ruling. It took, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's just tell you where we stand in terms of quarry production. So here it is, the end of 1930. There's 18 years of operation, and now we are over $1 million of cubic yards of trap rock taken from the Sleeping Giant. Well, finally, May 10th, 1932, so this is 2 years after the association has bought the land, in 1932, there is a ruling in favor of the Sleeping Giant Park Association. Yes, in fact, the quarry has violated the lease. They can no longer take trap rock from that face because it's in violation of the lease, and the association prevailed. It was bittersweet because 4 days before that, James Toomey had dropped dead of a heart attack. So he did not prevail, but the giant did. So, what still remained was how the association would get rid of the quarry. Because even though the quarry could not continue to use that quarry face, they just moved right around to the back towards Tuttle Avenue, and they opened a new quarry face, as apparently was their right, on the north side of the mountain. Well, that was a problem. Didn't achieve the objective at all of the association. So there was a little bit of fatigue. Several of the members, including Dana, went out of town on an extended summer vacation. But there was a woman named Helen Porter. She was on the board. She was a single person. She owned a large house up here on Edge Hill and a small cabin at the base of the mountain. And she couldn't stand the quarrying continuing. So she went up to the quarry. She looked around a bit and then immediately came home and penned a letter to Mr. Regaluth. And in it, she pleaded that she just could not stand to see this destruction happening anymore and wanted to offer him a buyout. They negotiated back and forth, and they prevailed. At this point, Regaluth was really feeling the public sentiment, and she prevailed. It was another, I believe, $30,000 that was spent. So these were gigantic sums of money in the early Depression. And yet they were raising them in 5 and 6 months. So Helen Porter was very, very savvy. She was literally tugging at the heartstrings of Mr. Regaluth by explaining that she was raising money from women and children, dimes at a time. And she just couldn't let them down by letting rocks fly in the air. So there you are. So she prevailed, and that was wonderful. And it got to the point so that by 1933, the quarry operation was completely done, and the annual meeting of the Sleeping Giant Park Association was held here in the floor of the quarry. So it was quite a dramatic sight, and it was a total victory. Now, the Sleeping Giant Park Association owned and had turned over to the state the entire head to toe of the Sleeping Giant. That was all celebrated last two Saturdays ago. On October 12th, 2024, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the park's founding. And of course, we had a chance to acknowledge the dedication and stewardship both of Toomey and of Dana and so many of the other people who worked so hard on the park over these years. You may remember that on March 15th, 2018, there was a microburst that took down thousands of trees in the park. And it reminded me, as I thought about this, about the stanza in Donald Hall's poem. I read you the first and the last stanza, but how about this? Talk about prophetic. I was afraid the waking arm would break from the loose earth and rub against his eyes, a fist of trees, and the whole country tremble in the exultant labor of his rise. How did Donald Hall know? I don't know. But fortunately, in the months that followed, countless of the park's volunteers did clear the fallen wood and return the park to a safe and operating tranquility. And now we have to wonder, will we continue to save the giant? Let's hope so. Thank you.
We may have a moment for a couple of questions. Yes. That's a very good point. The state actually, there was a request that came in from the Sleeping Giant Park Association to the state. And I believe it was at their 1927 meeting, the state's 1927 meeting, that they officially declared the name to be Sleeping Giant State Park. There had been a little ruckus before because in the very early days of the Park Association, there was a gift of $40,000 that was handed to James Toomey, and he took it to a board meeting and he said, this is great. But the fine print was that the name of the park had to be named after the benefactor. Now, I've never found any documentation that explained who that benefactor was. I believe it was someone from Waterbury. Anyway, there was no interest in changing the name, so the park was officially named in 1927. But it did start out as the mountain at Mount Carmel. Yeah, good question, thank you. Yes?
What's the history of the monument up on top?
The monument is a Works Progress Administration project. It was built in the 30s. It was dedicated, I think, in 1939. Many of the stones that were used to build the tower came from the various small cabins that were on the ridges at the top of the mountain. When the state park was fully opened, they, given the history of vandalism at Willis Cook's cabin, they took down all those cabins to avoid any concern, and then those stones, many were used for the tower. Yes?
I hike up there quite a bit, so I know all the trails, and I'm amazed at how well laid out the trails are. Who laid out the trails and when?
So, there are actually a couple people in this room who could answer this question much better than I. The trails, there have been people in the history of the Park Association who did develop those trails very carefully. They're currently maintained by a very dedicated trail crew. They meet every Sunday morning. You too could be on the trail crew. And they continue to work on them. As you can see, they're well marked, they're well blazed. We have paper maps. There are apps that tell you where the trails are. There's understanding of the level of difficulty, as well as geology markers, wildlife markers, and so forth. Yeah, it's quite deliberate. There are 32 miles altogether of trails on the giant. Glad you hike. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the momentum about just keeping this area as a state park by the state itself. What was, how developed was the state park system at that time?
There are 130 state parks in the state of Connecticut. This was not by any means the earliest. I think it's about halfway through in the evolution of state parkdom in Connecticut. So it's certainly not the oldest and not the newest, and not the newest. But for instance, it's very, as you can imagine, I'm sure you know, that the park system in the state of Connecticut is quite different. There's a real diversity in terrain or purposes, and obviously location. It's sort of right in the middle. Oh, yes.
There are so many postcards from the teens through the 30s probably with Sleeping Giant on it. And I think about the early 20th century as being a time of an explosion in visual culture, right? And color, lithography, printing, right? And so it's really interesting to think about postcards and the ways that maybe circulates the image and the profile of Sleeping Giant and makes it not just a local attraction, right? But then those postcards are going out around the state, probably throughout the nation as well, by people who are visiting. And so I wonder what you think about this idea of postcards and the image of the Sleeping Giant as being a part of the story of a wider galvanizing of public opinion towards preserving it.
Right. Well, I think you're exactly right. So I myself, the only reason that I'm up here tonight is because I started taking photographs of the Sleeping Giant, and I got completely hooked, maybe obsessed. I just completely fell in love with the giant. I don't think of it as a landform, so it's a little hard to resist that spiritual transition where you start to think about its form and its form being a human form and all those sorts of things. So I think that's very, very, very important. Might be another photograph here. Here are some pictures of the quarry ruins. I was just, I thought I had a picture here. Sorry, it seems like I don't. A photograph of the vistas. So I started taking vistas of the giant every time I could get any kind of distance. So I hiked up Peter's Rock. Several of you in this room did it with me on a February or a January morning. The opening picture was taken from the top of West Rock. I have continued to try to convince the manager, the store manager at Home Depot in North Haven to let me up on the roof hatch. Well, there's something that, to your point, there's something really wonderful about the idea of commercialism, 21st century commercialism right before you, and the sleeping giant in repose right in the background. So that there is, I think, I'm not the only one. I mean, you go to Sleeping Giant on any beautiful day, and it's just filled with people who have a special connection there. It's just a really, really cool place. One more. Yes, thank you.
Unfortunately, I won't be able to attend this Saturday. Can you just give me a little information on what that's about?
Much of the material, there is a great deal of material downstairs in the library, the Whitney Library, which is right below us here, on Sleeping Giant. There, that blue ground map that you saw lives downstairs. It's quite large. And then the scrapbooks of Arnold Dana, the second president of the Sleeping Giant Park Association, and the crusader about the head. Those scrapbooks live here. Some of them, he was a Yale grad, many of them are at Yale, but the ones that pertain to things that are about New Haven that aren't specifically Yale, including his affinity for Sleeping Giant Park, that scrapbook is down here, and then there are other materials as well. So it's an interesting treasure trove. I think for me, one of the things that continues to be both fun and just a little bit vexing is the fact that there was one lovely small book written about Sleeping Giant's history by Nancy Sachet. It's now in its fourth printing. The last one was 1997. Other than that, there's almost nothing written about it. There's one or two sentences in the history of Hamden or in other histories, but there's very little written about it. So all this information, all of these papers, the letters, the discussions back and forth between all these people, Toomey's speeches, those are all original source material. And so it's fascinating to sit there and hold the carbon copy of a speech or a letter that one of these people wrote. And you're seeing their little notes in pencil on the corners. Sometimes I won't repeat them. But really fascinating information. So much of that is here downstairs in the Whitney Library.
But we're talking about the Native Americans. Wasn't it a myth or something?
Right. Habamak is how the Quinnipiac thought of the sleeping giant and how the sleeping giant came to be in eternal slumber and not a spirit walking among them. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for being here.